John Bennett was convinced that going to the nursing home would be the end of his story. He resisted until the last moment, never imagining that his life was about to change in an unexpected way. Upon arrival, something made him stop. What he found there surprised him so deeply that everything he believed began to crumble. But was this the beginning of a second chance he never expected? Follow this life story and discover what transformed John's destiny forever. John Bennett, now 80 years old, gazed out of the window of his house for the last time. The late afternoon light made the yard look more beautiful than usual, like a silent farewell. He felt a mixture of sadness and acceptance as he left the place where he had lived the most important moments of his life. This house, where he and Mary, his late wife, had raised their children, was now saying goodbye to him. His children, Emily and Michael, were eager to help, but John knew what that meant: the end of his independence. Every visit from them brought a discussion, a reminder that he could no longer take care of himself. The last fall he had, while trying to reach a pot on the top shelf, left him with a sprained ankle, only strengthening their argument. "Dad, you can't stay here alone anymore," Emily said in a soft but firm voice. John grumbled quietly, feeling like a child being scolded by his own kids. Deep down, he knew they were right, but that didn't ease the weight of his hurt pride. After much discussion and insistence, he finally gave in, accepting what seemed to be his only option: a nursing home. The place was described as comfortable, with good care and beautiful gardens, but that didn't matter. To John, it represented a prison. He didn't say a word on the way there, his thoughts heavy as a stone on his chest. They arrived at the home on a gray-skied morning. Emily parked the car at the entrance, and Michael was already waiting for them at reception. The building was imposing, with a brick facade and large windows letting the sunlight flood the interior. Inside, everything was clean and organized, with smiling staff and well-kept plants, but to John, it all felt forced, almost artificial. "Dad, you're going to like it here," Emily said, trying to sound optimistic as she guided him inside. John just nodded, without looking at her. He was hurt. It wasn't just about moving to a nursing home, but because he felt that by agreeing to this, he had lost an internal battle. He felt his children had won, but at what cost? He knew they weren't wrong. The fact that he could no longer care for himself was undeniable, but it was still hard to accept that this moment had arrived. As soon as they entered, a nurse came to greet them. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, and dressed in a spotless uniform. "Welcome, Mr. Bennett," she said with a smile that seemed genuine, but John couldn't find the strength to return it. He simply followed her, dragging his feet, feeling the weight of every step. He didn't want to be there. When they arrived at the room that would be John's new home, he barely looked around. The nurse showed him how everything worked: the call bell beside the bed for assistance, the wardrobe for his clothes, and the adapted bathroom for ease of use. Everything was very functional, and that only reinforced the feeling that he had lost his freedom. "If you need anything, just call," the nurse said before leaving, gently closing the door. Emily and Michael stood in silence, watching their father approach the window, as if trying to distance himself from the world. John took a deep breath, looking at the small garden outside. It wasn't the same view he had at home, where every tree and flower had meaning. Here, everything seemed generic, as if it were just another place cared for without love. He began to unpack his belongings, moving slowly and methodically. He removed the few clothes he had brought, placing them in the wardrobe with mechanical precision. But his hands stopped when he found a photo of Mary. He stared at her face, remembering how life had been before everything changed. "I miss you," he murmured to the photo, feeling a tear threaten to fall. Emily and Michael tried to cheer him up, but there wasn't much they could do. He was hurt, and although he knew it wasn't their fault, the anger and resentment were there. They were only trying to do what was best for him, but they couldn't understand what it was like to leave an entire life behind. "Dad, you'll get used to it. There are good people here, and they'll take good care of you," Michael said, without much conviction. Emily nodded, trying to be more optimistic, but deep down, they knew this wasn't the choice John wanted to make. After some time, the children said goodbye, promising to visit him often. John waved, but he felt an emptiness in his chest as they left. When the door closed, he felt completely alone. The nursing home was silent, except for the distant sound of footsteps and muffled voices in the hallway. He sat on the bed, feeling the weight of loneliness. The hours dragged on, and he couldn't stop thinking about how much he missed his old life. He decided to leave the room, even if just to walk around. Maybe the garden would offer some tranquility. As he walked through the hallways, John noticed the white walls and identical doors, each with a resident's name on it. The place was clean, efficient, but lacking in personality. The staff passed by him with polite smiles, but he felt invisible. It was as if he were walking through limbo. When he reached the garden, the fresh air touched his face. He started walking aimlessly, observing the flowers, which were too orderly to feel natural. Everything was beautiful, but in a sterile, lifeless way. Then something caught his attention. A woman was sitting on one of the benches, looking at the flowers. John stopped walking. His eyes fixed on her. There was something familiar about her, something he hadn't seen in decades. He slowly walked toward the woman. His heart began to race in a way it hadn't in years. Her hair, completely white, was tied up in a delicate bun. Even from a distance, he could recognize the soft features of her face. "Margaret," he murmured, as if it were impossible. John approached slowly, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him or if this was really happening. Margaret, the name echoed in his mind, bringing back a wave of memories he thought had been dormant forever. His heart raced, his hands trembled slightly, and he finally stopped in front of her. The woman lifted her eyes slowly, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to freeze. "John?" Margaret's voice was frail, but full of recognition. There was a silent surprise in her eyes. It was as if she had been waiting for him for years, without truly believing that this moment would come. John felt a lump in his throat. How many decades had passed since they last saw each other? He could hardly believe that this reunion was really happening, and for an instant, he wondered what destiny was trying to do. "Margaret, is it really you?" He sat down beside her on the bench, his legs shaky with emotion. They sat in silence for a moment, simply absorbing each other's presence. Margaret offered a discreet smile, almost shy, as she looked at him. "I've been here for a while, but I never thought I'd find you like this." The lightness of her voice contrasted with the weight of the memories that surrounded them. They began to talk, and soon the words flowed as if there hadn't been a 40-year gap between them. Memories of their youth, of walks, laughter, and conversations under the stars came flooding back. They remembered how they met at a neighborhood party when both were young and full of dreams, and how they spent endless afternoons strolling through the streets of their hometown. But that relationship didn't survive time. Flashbacks filled John's mind, himself in his 20s, holding Margaret's hands and promising her that he would return soon after accepting a job in another city. They believed their love would survive the distance, but slowly, life pulled them apart. The letters became fewer, the calls rare, until time and life separated them completely. Margaret looked at him with a mixture of affection and melancholy. "I've always wondered what would have happened if we had stayed together." John lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of the regret he had carried for years. "I've wondered the same," he confessed quietly. "I always thought I'd have time to fix things, to come back. But now, I think life isn't generous with time." They looked at each other, understanding the pain and tenderness of the moment. So much had gone unsaid between them, so many conversations left unspoken, so many moments that could have been. Now, sitting together again, it felt like time had given them a small reprieve, a space to relive a fraction of what they had lost. Margaret sighed lightly, turning her eyes back to the garden in front of them. "But we're here now, aren't we? There's still time, for some things." A soft smile lit her face, and John felt his heart warm. It was as if they had been gifted a second chance, even if late. However, as that feeling of renewal grew, a shadow of doubt lingered in the air. What if they were fooling themselves? What if time, relentless, had separated them so completely that some things simply couldn't be recovered? Despite the happiness of finding her again, John felt vulnerable. What would be left of them besides the memories of what they had never lived? With these confusing thoughts, he realized that, even though he felt close to Margaret, there was much to resolve. There was still fear. Did they have the strength and time to recreate what they had lost? As the days passed, John began to adapt to the routine at the nursing home. Though the environment still felt strange and like a constant reminder of his age and the limitations imposed by time, Margaret's presence made his stay more bearable, perhaps even welcoming. He and Margaret met every day. Their conversations flowed naturally, sometimes about the past, sometimes about the present. The regret for the distance life had put between them always lingered, but both seemed eager to leave those hurts behind. John felt that, slowly, a new kind of intimacy was forming, as if they were resuming the journey life had interrupted years ago. During this time, John got to know one of the younger nurses at the home, David. David was around 25 years old and always nearby, helping with the residents' daily tasks. He had a laid-back and simple demeanor, but he showed a genuine curiosity about the stories of the older residents. He was the type of person who listened, not just to respond, but to absorb the experiences and life lessons others had to offer. One day, while John was sitting in the garden, watching the flowers sway in the wind, David approached with a warm smile. "Everything all right here, Mr. Bennett?" "Need anything?" the young man asked, his tone friendly. John shook his head but invited David to sit. "You're a good young man, David. I like the way you handle things around here." David laughed, a little embarrassed. "I try my best. There's a lot I've learned here, more than I could have imagined." John looked at him, studying the expression on the young man's face. There was something there that went beyond the typical curiosity of youth. "And what exactly have you been learning?" David hesitated but eventually opened up. "I think you all understand what really matters in life. What's worth keeping and what's worth letting go of. I've been trying to figure that out for myself lately." Curious, John encouraged him to continue, and with a nervous laugh, David admitted that he had been struggling with his relationship with his parents. He hadn't felt close to them in a long time, but working at the nursing home had made him reflect on his own family ties. "Seeing your stories, well, it's impossible not to think about what I can still change." John nodded, understanding immediately. He had felt that way before. Life is short, and the opportunities to make amends with the people we love don't always present themselves. "Let me tell you something, David. When you get to my age, the only thing that really stays with you are the memories. Don't let anger or pride steal away what you can still fix." David was silent for a moment, absorbing the advice. John's words seemed to carry more weight coming from someone who knew the cost of regret all too well. "And what about you, Mr. Bennett? Is there anything you still wish to fix?" John smiled slightly and looked across the garden, where Margaret was speaking with a nurse. "Maybe I've been given a second chance now, something I never thought I'd have. Life is strange like that sometimes." David followed John's gaze and smiled as well when he saw Margaret. "I see you two together every day. She seems very important to you." John sighed, his gaze distant as memories flooded back. "She is. She always has been. But life pulled us apart. I had plans, ambitions. There was a job in a different city, an opportunity that seemed like the chance of a lifetime. I left her waiting, promising I would return. But time passed, and I drifted away. The letters became less frequent until we stopped writing altogether." He paused, watching Margaret from afar, as if reliving each of those moments in his mind. "Margaret wrote me in her last letter, telling me she had found someone else. She couldn't wait for me anymore. And I understood. I understood why she did it. But that doesn't mean I got over it." David shifted uncomfortably on the bench, feeling the weight of John's words. "And now that you've found each other again, do you think you can recover what was lost?" John smiled, but it was a smile mixed with pain and hope. "I don't know, David. Time is treacherous. But if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that we can't always fix what's broken, but we can build something new. And maybe that's enough." David sat in silence, reflecting on the story he had just heard. There was so much between the lines of John's life, choices that had seemed right at the time but had left deep marks of regret. At the same time, David wondered how many things in his own life could still be repaired. In the days that followed, as he helped John with his daily tasks, David spent more time talking with him, listening to stories about how John had met Margaret and how fate had separated them. John, in turn, felt that his conversations with David helped him reflect on the value of opportunities. It was almost as if, by advising the young man, he was also advising himself. That late afternoon, as John walked back to his room, he felt strange. He had a new hope growing within him, but also a growing doubt. Was this second chance real, or just an illusion created by his own expectations? John woke up that morning with a sense of emptiness. Something was wrong, although he didn't know what. Mornings at the nursing home had become a bit more bearable in recent days, mainly because of Margaret. She had brought back a joy he hadn't felt in years. Knowing that they could share their days together, talking and reminiscing, made everything lighter. But that morning, Margaret wasn't there. John noticed her absence at the breakfast table, where they usually met. He felt a slight pang of concern but tried to convince himself that she might just be resting or running a bit late. He didn't want to think the worst. Later, as he walked down the hallway, he saw one of the nurses with a serious expression. His heart began to beat faster as he approached. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying an anxiety he couldn't control. "Do you know where Margaret is? I haven't seen her today." The nurse paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "She wasn't feeling well last night, Mr. Bennett. We had to take her to the hospital. She's under observation, but we don't have more details on her condition yet." John felt the world spin for a moment. The fear of losing Margaret again consumed him with an almost unbearable intensity. They had barely reunited, and now life seemed ready to take her away from him once more. He tried to hide the growing desperation in his chest, but the impact was visible in his eyes. I need to know how she is," he muttered, more to himself than to the nurse. He returned to his room, each step heavy, feeling a crushing emptiness. Sitting on the edge of his bed, John wondered if this was yet another one of life's cruel twists, as if fate were toying with him, offering a second chance only to snatch it away again. He spent hours like that, lost in thoughts and fears, feeling time drag on slowly. Later, his daughter Emily came to visit, as she had promised to do regularly. She found him sitting in his room, staring out the window. He barely noticed when she entered, his mind filled with thoughts of Margaret. "Dad?" Emily's voice brought John back to the present. He looked at his daughter, and for the first time, she noticed the deep sadness on his face. "What happened?" John sighed deeply, feeling old and vulnerable. "Margaret got sick," he said, his voice breaking. "They took her to the hospital, and I don't know if she's coming back." Emily sat down beside him, taking his hand. "Dad, you never told me about Margaret before." He took a deep breath, hesitating for a moment. "Is the love of my youth," he confessed. "We met when we were young, but life separated us. She was everything to me, Emily. And now that I've found her again, I feel like it's too late." Emily squeezed her father's hand more tightly, feeling the emotion he was trying to contain. She had never seen him so vulnerable. "Dad, you have to have faith. If she came back into your life, maybe it's because there's still something you need to live together. Don't lose that hope." John allowed himself a faint smile, appreciating his daughter's kindness. She was right. Maybe there was a chance. Maybe Margaret would return, and he could finally express everything he had kept inside for so long. But the doubt remained, dark and constant, at the back of his mind. "Do you want to tell me more about her?" Emily asked, trying to comfort her father in the best way she could. She knew that sharing those memories would be important to him. John nodded. He began to talk about Margaret, the afternoons they spent together, the plans they made, the promises they couldn't keep. As he spoke, Emily saw a spark return to her father's eyes, a spark she hadn't seen in years. Their story was sad, but there was a beauty in the love he still felt for Margaret, even after all this time. That afternoon, Emily stayed with John longer than usual, listening to him talk. She promised to stay close, helping him cope with Margaret's absence. When she finally left, John felt a little stronger, though the fear of losing Margaret never completely went away. Deep down, he knew that if Margaret returned to the nursing home, he would need to act. He couldn't let time steal this second chance from them, if they still had one. The days following Margaret's hospitalization were filled with waiting and uncertainty. John tried to keep hope alive, but the fear of losing Margaret again still loomed over him. Emily's visit had brought him some comfort, and her words echoed in his mind. If Margaret came back, he wouldn't let time separate them again. A few days later, the news arrived: Margaret was back at the nursing home. John felt a deep sense of relief when he saw her sitting in the garden, as always, although she looked more fragile than before. Her smile when she saw him, however, was the same as ever, gentle and full of tenderness. John knew he had to do something special, something that would show Margaret how much she meant to him. It was time to make up for the lost time. That's when an idea took shape in his mind. He wanted to give Margaret a romantic dinner, something they had never had when they were young. A moment just for the two of them, as if time had given them a reprieve to live out what they had always wanted. That same afternoon, he called David and Emily to talk. With their support, they began planning a candlelit dinner for John and Margaret. It would be simple but meaningful, enough to show Margaret how important she was. "I think it's a wonderful idea," Emily said, visibly moved. She knew how much this meant to her father. "Margaret will love it. We'll make sure it's exactly what you deserve." David was also excited. "I can help set up the space. We can use one of the common rooms and prepare everything for the two of you. It's going to be amazing, Mr. Bennett." In the days that followed, John dedicated himself to planning every detail. He chose one of the smaller common rooms at the home, located in a more private area. With the help of David and Emily, they set up a table with a linen tablecloth, candles scattered around the room, and soft music playing in the background. It wasn't a fancy dinner, but it was special. It was their second chance. On the night of the dinner, John was as nervous as a teenager. He put on a shirt he hadn't worn in a long time, fixed his hair, and took a deep breath. He had waited for this moment his whole life, even without knowing how much he wanted it. When Margaret arrived at the room, escorted by David, she stopped at the door, surprised. Her eyes sparkled as she took in the scene before her, the decorated table, the soft candles lighting the room, and John, who stood up as soon as he saw her. "John, what is all this?" she asked, visibly emotional. He smiled, taking her hand and guiding her to the table. "It's the date we never had. It's the moment I always wanted to give you." Margaret laughed softly, but her eyes were filled with tears. They sat down, and for a while, simply enjoyed each other's presence. The dinner was calm, unhurried. The music in the background set the tone for their conversations, which drifted between the past and the present. John watched her with a mixture of affection and admiration. There was something magical about that night, as if they were reclaiming a piece of the youth they had lost. He spoke little, but his words carried the weight of the years of distance. "I always thought time would be generous with me, that I'd have a second chance to make things right," he said quietly but firmly. "But life, it's unpredictable. I lost so much time, Margaret. And if I could go back, I would have stayed with you." Margaret smiled, squeezing his hand. "John, we're here now. That's what matters. Not what we could have done, but what we're doing now." He was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. She was right. The past couldn't be changed, but the present was right in front of them, and he wouldn't let it slip away again. After they finished dinner, they danced. Slowly, to the sound of the soft music, John held her in his arms, and they moved around the small room as if time had stopped. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of Margaret's presence, silently thanking for the second chance. In the candlelight, as they swayed gently, John felt like he was finally where he was meant to be, by Margaret's side, where he had always belonged. The days following the candlelit dinner were filled with a lightness John hadn't experienced in decades. He and Margaret were finally together, without the weight of the past between them, and life seemed to smile upon them, even within the confines of the nursing home. They treated each other like young lovers, and the other residents soon noticed the sparkle in their eyes. Whenever they walked through the gardens, holding hands, they were met with smiles and approving glances from those around them. John knew they didn't have much time. Both of their healths were fragile, and he could feel it in his body. Climbing stairs was harder, their walks had to be shorter, and Margaret, though she tried to hide it, sometimes became breathless, which brought a silent panic to John's heart. Time, relentless, seemed determined to take its toll, and John knew he had to cherish every moment. That's when John decided it was time to introduce Margaret to his children. He knew their relationship was something special, and he wanted Emily and Michael to meet the woman who had brought back a part of him that had long been dormant. One weekend, Emily and Michael came for a visit, and John met them in the lobby. He seemed nervous, which was rare for a man his age. Margaret waited in the garden, at one of the tables under the trees. "I have a surprise for you," he said, trying to keep calm. The two followed him down the hall, exchanging curious glances. When they reached the garden, John paused for a moment, watching Margaret from a distance. She was wearing a light blouse, her hair in a simple bun that revealed her natural elegance. He called to her softly, and Margaret turned with a warm smile. "This is Margaret," John said, with an emotion he couldn't hide. "She's the love of my life. And thanks to you, I had the chance to find her again." Emily and Michael were surprised, but quickly approached. The smiles on their faces showed that they understood how much this meant to their father. They spent some time talking with Margaret, and soon realized that her presence had changed something deep within John. He was happier, lighter, and this new phase of his life didn't go unnoticed by his children. "Dad, we're so happy for you," Emily said, holding her father's hand lovingly. "It's amazing to see you like this, so full of life again." John smiled, grateful to see his children getting along so well with Margaret. For him, this was validation that, despite all the uncertainties of life, this second chance was real and deserved. In the months that followed, John and Margaret lived peaceful and happy days, enjoying the time they had together. They spent their mornings in the garden, sharing conversations and laughter, and in the evenings, they sat together, watching the starry sky from the nursing home's porch. However, Margaret's health began to decline more rapidly. Her hospital visits became more frequent, and John could see the weariness in her eyes. Each time she returned to the home, he welcomed her with relief, but he knew their time was running out. Both of their bodies could no longer keep up with their desire to live longer together. John, too, was feeling the weight of age. The joint pains worsened, the days seemed shorter, and he felt tired more often. Even so, he never stopped being by Margaret's side, holding her hand when she was weak and reminding her of the good moments they had shared. They knew their time was running out, but they didn't speak of it openly. There was a silent understanding between them. One night, as they sat together on the porch, Margaret looked at John with a deep gaze. "You've given me the greatest happiness of my life, John. Even if it came at the end. I wouldn't change a thing. Every moment was perfect." John held her hand tightly, feeling her words echo inside him. He knew that, at some point, he would have to say goodbye. But for now, they were together, and that was what mattered. A few months later, the nursing home became enveloped in a heavier silence. John Bennett, now in frail health, had lost Margaret, the woman who had brought light back into his final years. Their farewell was peaceful and serene. Margaret passed away gently, holding John's hand until her last breath. Though devastated, John felt incredibly grateful for having had the chance to love her once again. John's children, Emily and Michael, continued to visit him frequently. They could see how their father was dealing with the loss, but they also noticed that he wasn't as heartbroken as before. It was as if, even without Margaret by his side, their reunion had restored something within him that had been lost for a long time. That day, Emily and Michael visited the nursing home to spend some more time with their father. As they conversed, John spoke of how Margaret had changed him, how her love had made him realize that, even in the final stages of life, there was still room for new stories, new connections, and new beginnings. He spoke of regrets, yes, but also of the comfort in having found love again, even if it had come late. "You gave me this chance," John said, looking at his children with a peaceful smile. "If it weren't for you, I would never have found Margaret again. You gave me more than you could ever imagine." Emily, her eyes filled with tears, squeezed her father's hand. Michael, equally emotional, nodded silently. They knew John didn't have much time left, but there was a peace in his words, a serenity that comforted their hearts. Before they left, they all went to Margaret's grave, located in a small cemetery near the nursing home. With the help of David, John made sure to bring fresh flowers every day. When they arrived, John knelt before the headstone, gently touching the cold stone. "Thank you for loving me, Margaret," he whispered, knowing that his own time was drawing near as well. "I will never forget what we had." After the visit, as they walked back to the nursing home, John spoke with David, the young nurse who had become a dear friend. David had learned much from John and Margaret, and the impact they had on his life was clear. "You've taught me so much, Mr. Bennett," David said, smiling. "About love, about time, about what really matters. I'll never forget that." John gave a tired but sincere smile. "David, time is a strange thing. Sometimes it gives, sometimes it takes. But the important thing is what you do with it, while you have it." With those words, John left a legacy. He knew that even after he was gone, what he and Margaret had shared would not be lost. Their love, though brief, had left its mark, not only on John, but on Emily, Michael, and David, who would carry these lessons with him for the rest of his life. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.